what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Welcome back to Seeds of Revolution. Today it is my absolute wonderful privilege and honor to be interviewing one of my favorite people of all time, Sandra Carr. Sandra is a maker. She is an instructor in the fine furniture program at Camosun College, and she is a woodworker and an artist. And she also happens to be the person who tried to teach me woodworking and succeeded to various degrees, and where she failed, it was my failing and not hers. So Sandra, welcome to Seeds of Revolution.
Thanks, Joel.
I was wondering if you could start by just telling us a little bit about your background as a maker, how you got into craft and woodworking specifically, and what it is about making that you love.
Sure. Well, it kind of happened by accident. I thought I was going to be a chemist, and then I thought maybe I would do geography. So basically, I was at university not knowing what I should be doing. And I heard about this program at Camosun College. My partner at the time was taking carpentry. So I thought, I'll take some time off and just try this, and then I'll go back next year. And I didn't go back. I just kept going.
And you graduated the fine furniture program at Camosun, and then you opened your own woodworking shop.
I did, yeah.
How long did you do that for?
I don't know, like over 20 years.
What is it like? We talked a little bit before I hit record about the politics of making and the politics of craft.
And I said, why are you talking about politics?
Because you lived it. You lived the politics of being a woman and a queer woman in a field that is traditionally and probably still to a large extent dominated by men. And you did that for 20 years. What was that like?
Fun most of the time. Like anything, it has its pluses and minuses, but I always felt like so lucky that I was one of the people that was actually making craft. And it was a very deliberate choice to do that, because I probably could have made a better living doing almost anything else. It's a lot about just lifestyle and intentional. There's just an intentionality to it. So I made that choice and that trade-off.
There must have been challenges as a woman and as a queer person in the trades.
Yes, but I don't know if I'm the right person to really speak to that. I worked for myself most of the time, and I had, when I was working for other people, I always had good experiences, and I think I kind of got lucky working with some really great people who just treated me like anyone else. But I've certainly spoken to many friends and colleagues that is not their experience at all. So I'm very aware of that, but that didn't really impact me too much, which is kind of funny, but it's true.
And for our listeners, for the 20 years you spent in running your own shop, that was making furniture, right?
Yes.
Okay. What, it seems, and we talked about this in class, there's this new craft movement of DIYers and people who are discovering the pleasures of making something for yourself. I was hoping you could speak to that, and maybe especially why you think so many people are now, like myself, getting into this craft later in life and discovering a joy for it that they never knew they had.
I blame Instagram.
Oh, yeah. That's a good point.
I think there's just this, well, actually, that was tongue in cheek, but it's also partly true that there's like this exposure. And knowing we were going to do this interview, I was reflecting a little bit and just thinking about how it's almost become fetishized, if that's the right word,
Yeah.
that it's like almost like maker porn, I would classify it as a lot of people's like feeds and Instagram. Um, and it's attractive because you see someone doing something that looks really cool and there's like a whole mystique about it. But that comes from somewhere, and the somewhere is like the pure satisfaction of doing something for yourself. And many of us are so divorced from like practical, even just practical things. Like the world is mystifying. I don't know how most of the things I interact with on a daily basis that are electronic or mechanical work. So to have this like experience of working with your hands and your mind and your own creativity at any scale is like feels empowering, I think, for people.
Something that I felt very strongly before I took your class, and one of the reasons I wanted to take the class, was I felt, to use the Marxist terminology, alienated from my work.
Mhm.
My work was all up in my head,
Mhm.
typing things on a computer, never ever making something, never creating something and seeing it manifest in the world. Do you get a sense of satisfaction when you are making art, making furniture, that you're not alienated from your labor? Like your labor is actually, you're using your own personal labor to sort of add value to your life and add value, physical value to your life in the world?
Well, yeah, it's the complete opposite of being alienated
Yeah.
from something. Like you are birthing not just a thing, but your own ideas. And it's like an expression of a certain process that you went through. And even though you may be using machines, say, it doesn't
Computer assisted routers, for example.
We might have been talking about that.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter because you are still, as an autonomous person, controlling what those machines do. And you're not just doing a single process that isn't related to the whole host of other processes that you go through. So yeah, it's like you get a high from it. It still, after I don't know how many years, I think 28 years now since I started doing this, there's still an absolute thrill in, and this is what really got me hooked, was to have an idea about a thing and to go through the work to like design it and think it through and do all the brain stuff. And then you make the thing and then it's sitting there in front of you and you're looking at this thing and you're like, wow, there's that thing right there. And it came out of my brain and my ideas and I just put it together. And it's super satisfying.
When you're looking at that thing that you just made, do you feel or think that that is art?
It depends on what it is. But yes, I have made many pieces of art.
Why does it depend on what it is?
I don't know. Some utilitarian things are they're just serving a purpose and there's not like the level of creativity and craft that goes into them. But many things are like very intentional and um, require a very high degree of skill. Um, even the But even now, like my thought about what is art and what is craft is changing a lot as I'm sort of realizing or just embracing the end of the craft that doesn't have to necessarily do with skill. And there's a whole movement about like in craft that is anti-mastery.
Being content to be an amateur?
I wouldn't even say that, but it's kind of, I think it's more of an art perspective where you don't need to be like a master at woodworking to create really amazing work. So it's not that you don't have to have the level of craft limit you creatively. So you can know a little bit and do a lot with a little bit of skill and a lot of ideas.
Do you agree with me that craft education and even artistic education has sort of fallen out of favor, especially when we're educating, people in middle school and high school? It seems to be more STEM focused, more Common Core math focused, more you need to learn skills to get a job, and oftentimes job excludes the trades. When people say job, they're talking about sitting in front of a computer in an office building.
I think that the focus on what is legitimate creative pursuits has changed.
Mm-hmm.
Like hundreds of years ago, oil painting would be a legitimate creative pursuit. I know there's a very well-known and amazing painter in the Cowichan Valley who is now an amazing tattoo artist. And he's applying all of his art school background and his incredible talent to do tattoo work. So I think what we value and what we see as a successful direction is also graphic design and computer game design. So I think there's just a different focus that probably is more STEM focused, like in digital media and communications, that is, quote unquote, the legitimate direction for the artwork. So more like what I do and other traditional forms of craft and art are maybe a little bit more marginalized. But there's even a resurgence in broom making. It's totally a thing. Spoon carving, totally a thing. Shoemaking is actually undergoing this renaissance. So handmade shoes, 50 years ago, it would have been probably some old family that has been doing it for generations. Now it's some young person who's I want to do this, and they know how to reach a market that will support them, because that is all completely changed too.
We talked a little bit about, we're talking the renaissance of craft, the individual motivation behind pursuing craft, and the combination of seeing things on Instagram, but also not, wanting to experience personally the act of creativity. Do you think that there is larger social and political factors at work as well, in terms of why people are embracing things like shoemaking that would have been inconceivable 50 years ago?
Yeah, it's kind of like the next revolution, really. So we had the Industrial Revolution, and then probably some mechanical revolution after, during the World Wars. And then
the computing revolution.
And then the technological and computing revolution. And so in some way, this is maybe part of what's coming next.
Do you think it's a sort of a negative reaction to the technological revolution, that people are not fulfilled or as fulfilled as they thought they would be by that revolution?
Yes. Yeah. And this is never going to change. We need more than phones and computers and that life. Yes, there's types of community and satisfaction that we draw from those things, but they're not a real experience in the way that a true creative experience is. I don't think it.
You introduced me to one of my favorite, one of my favorite makers and writers, William Morris. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about who William Morris is, and then I'm going to pepper you with questions about him.
Okay. He was what is often called the father of the arts and crafts movement, which for a lot of people, and myself when I was in school included, was a stylistic movement. It was a decorative arts style.
And this is the end of the 19th century, middle 19th century in England?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But Morris was a socialist, and he had a very successful letterpress and interior design firm. But his whole reason for the interior design and the furniture and all of that was as a reaction against the social ills of the Industrial Revolution and the disconnect between people's work and labor and the human spirit. And he saw it as, and other individuals did as well, as this huge social ill that was, children in factories, and like it was a big change, and something that I try and impress upon my students, and that I've really come to appreciate, is that we are kind of like the frog in the pot, and our entire lives we've been living in this post-industrial revolution world, but it wasn't always that way. And it's not that it was a utopia by any means, but a lot of the things we just take for granted now, if you kind of stop and think about it, it's like, oh, it didn't used to be that way. And it really hasn't been that long either. And there's always been craft production, just like there is now, but it sure looked a lot different. So there was like major inventions during the Industrial Revolution, like in textiles especially, and in coal production and metallurgy, that kind of like made all this happen. So it really did change the world, and we're still like, the ripples are still there. Like, we're still dealing with the fallout of that.
Because of you, I fell in love with William Morris, and because of you, I wrote a research paper on him, and
It's in my All-Stars folder, by the way. I started one.
I made it in the All-Stars.
Yeah.
One of the things I loved most about William Morris, which I wrote about in that research paper for you, was his definition of art, and his idea that art is simply the pleasure we take in our labor. Whatever it is, teaching, mining, glass blowing, woodworking, computer making, investing your labor with purposefulness, but also having the time and the energy and the ability to use your labor to make something beautiful. Again, doesn't matter what it is, but to add some aesthetic beauty to the world. And that is actually art. How do you respond to that take?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, right off, I think there's many, many, many kinds of art. And the purpose of art is often not to be beautiful or to bring our own selves pleasure. But it often does that, especially, like, I can only speak about this personally. Well, maybe I can speak about it more than personally. I guess I do teach some of this.
You do teach it.
I do teach it.
You do it and you teach it.
I do it and I teach it, yeah. So yes, I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. And you can't like be a maker or an artist and not feel that. Like, it's a very like centering place to be. And we get in the zone and you like focus on a project or an art piece, and it's like you get all consumed by it. And I think there's a beauty in just that, to be like so engaged with the world. And it might be your own world. You could be locked away in your studio doing the work and it doesn't see the light of day, but it is an expression of self and a presence, I guess I would say.
And Morris goes on to talk about, one of the biggest, most fundamental problems with capitalism is that by commodifying labor, you completely remove, if not destroy, the artistic sensibility and the aesthetic that people invested in their labor.
That I find a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Like, I sometimes wonder what we would make if we didn't have to earn a living, right? Like,
what would you make if you didn't have to earn a living?
Oh, right now it changes from week to week. I would make greenwood chairs.
Yeah. What's a greenwood chair?
It's a different way of working. It actually is kind of pre-industrial. It is pre-industrial revolution, where you take a green or unseasoned log and you don't cut it up with saws. You split it out with like wedges and different prying tools, and you're using the different drying properties and material properties to make something that's really strong.
See, to me, that's the perfect example of what William Morris is talking about, right? Is that the pleasure you're taking in this deed to produce a chair, and you're purposely choosing to make it in such a way that's far more intensive, but also far more like aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, totally. I just did this. I was very privileged to go take a chair making class in Michigan, and we made an American Windsor chair, which is sort of the quintessential Greenwood type chair. And the form originated in England, but really came into its own on the East Coast of the United States. And it was a 7-day course. And I knew a lot about it, and I'd done a little bit of it, but I just got into this absolute zone of like, I felt high every day actually making this one chair, because I was so close to the material, and it's just, there's such a beauty in the way that they are crafted. And even though I've been doing this for 28 years, I just felt like I reached this new level of understanding of working with the material precisely because I wasn't using any machines. So it's just exclusively with hand tools. And it taught me a lot. Even though I've worked with hand tools before, just this particular process just brought me that much closer. And as I was shaping the seat, it was an experience of being a sculptor. And I mean, there's often talk of this divide, or there has been talk of a divide between craft. Like, what is craft and what is art? What is the difference? And for the most part, that debate has kind of been settled.
How so?
That craft is using different materials, but there's still like art ideas behind the craft, and what you might have called like fine artists. There's just crossover now. Like if you look at textiles and weaving and conceptual art, it's like the materials are kind of irrelevant. It's the ideas behind them. At the same time, the ability to manipulate the materials is still valued. So there's a lot of crossover there. I can't remember where I was going with that.
Is it possible? So, I mean,
I know what I was going to say. So, sorry.
No, please.
So I'm working on this Windsor chair seat, which you look at it and you're like, yeah, okay, it's like maybe my grandparents' furniture. And I can't even believe I'm totally into these, but I'm just a complete nerd for them right now. And I'm making this chair seat all with hand tools. And it just dawns on me, I'm like, I am a sculptor right now.
Yeah.
And I got to spend time just being a sculptor. And I've never done like stonework. I've done a little bit of clay, but that's just what it felt like. And it's just an amazing feeling to just manipulate material that way.
Do you think that you could have that feeling and still be in the midst of capitalist production? Like you had that feeling while you were in the middle of probably a beautiful piece of rural Michigan.
Yes.
And you didn't have to worry about deadlines and making a profit. Is it possible to be a sculptor and be an artist and yet still make a living at it?
Yeah, totally.
Let me rephrase that. Is it possible to be an artist and to be a sculptor and still make a living at it if you're not part of the 0.1% of people who manage to, through luck or through skill, get paid?
It's weird. It's a weird time because it's both easier and harder in different ways.
Yeah.
So it's easier to reach a market because there's it's global.
Yeah.
And we have all of these platforms that also connect makers and artists directly with the people who will support them financially. But it's also harder because everyone wants to do that. So your competition is not just the one other studio in town. It's global. But there's also so many more diverse ways to earn a living from your work that didn't used to be there before. Like Patreon. And even one of the makers I follow, Peter Galbert, chairmaker in the States, he's writing a lot for Substack. So it's like this different ways to diversify your income.
Before you were teaching, when you were running your shop full time, Did you ever feel like you had to sacrifice your artistic sensibilities in order to keep the lights on and put food on the table and make your monthly bills?
Yeah, sometimes for sure. Yeah. But I tried to look at it differently. It's like, okay, there's like mostly my former partner and I, we worked with homeowners and did private commissions. We didn't really do like the big gallery scene. And I kind of liked that. I liked being connected with the person. So I didn't look at it as limiting. It was like, this is the way that I get to do this work. And for the most part, our clients came to us because they liked what we did, and we had a lot of autonomy over what we made. So in that way, I didn't really feel limited. Would I have loved to have like, hey, here's 6 months, just go explore something? No, I did not have that freedom. Not at all.
Do you feel an artistic sensibility when you teach?
Hmm. What do you mean by that?
That sense of joy and creation, like, you sat down at that seat and you felt yourself to be a sculptor.
Yeah, I do, but it's different. So where I feel that now, which I definitely do, is when I'm working with students on their projects, and like I'll come along and they'll have a design and we'll talk about it, and I'll come up with like 6 different ideas, and they'll just sort of look at me like, how do you
I remember looking at you that exact way
how do you
and
do that?
thinking that exact thing.
Yeah, and it's like, it's actually really liberating that it's not my work, and that's what makes it so easy.
Oh,
Because
that's
I
interesting.
don't, and I found that I'm like, oh, this is really interesting, because I'll struggle with my own stuff, and it's like, oh, is that a good idea? And get in my own way as I do sometimes. But with other people's stuff, it's like, oh, you could do this, you could do that, and how about this? And I'm like, oh, wow, okay.
Do you have,
And I get into the flow with that too, and it's fun, it's super fun.
when you're doing your own work, do you have woodworker's block?
Yes, sometimes, yeah. But I've learned that I just need to start.
Mm.
Yeah, it's just do something, kind of like sketching. I don't have an idea. Well, start drawing circles or squares or squiggly lines. It doesn't matter. It's in the movement. It's very somatic, I would say.
That's what trips me up, is I've convinced myself that I'm bad at it. Therefore, I don't even bother to get started. And then when I do get started, it looks, in my opinion, terrible. And so I get disenchanted and disillusioned, and I say, screw this, and then I walk away.
Yeah, but why are you doing it? Like, why are you doing the work in the first place?
To make something,
Yeah.
to try and create something beautiful to add to the world.
Yeah.
But then I get very disappointed because it's not beautiful.
Well, maybe not to the standard that
Yeah.
you're aiming for, but I think you talk to many makers and it's like, oh, it didn't quite turn out how I wanted. And the next person will look at it and go, well, that's absolutely amazing. And it's like, well, that's rubbish. It's like, well, does it even matter?
How do you think our larger society, obviously Canadian society is incredibly varied, but in general, how do you feel our society values makers, values people like yourself? Is there a pretty high premium on artists and craftspeople, or not?
No, not compared to the United States for sure.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think
I wouldn't
so.
have. Can you talk a little more about that? Because that's not what I would have guessed. Being an American, I would not think that we were more open to the arts than Canadians.
You seem to spend more on it, I think. I
Well,
don't
we
know, I've
spend
never-
more on everything.
Yeah, I've never seen like a study or anything. I was at Vancouver at this big interior design show, and I was listening to Brent Comer, who's a really well-known West Coast designer. He's an amazing artist, and he's done quite well at it. And he said something that has just stuck with me. And he was giving like one of the keynote addresses, and they were talking about, I don't know, the future of something or other. And he says, in Vancouver or on the West Coast, people will spend like $15,000 on a mountain bike, but they certainly won't spend that on a table,
Yeah.
right? So it circles back around to this question of what we value. And it is kind of, there are some weird things here because people will also spend like $2,500 to go take like a 2-week woodworking course to make one mediocre thing, but they won't pay the maker the value of that, whatever it is, chair, let's say. So people won't pay the value for the thing, but they'll pay the person to teach them how to do it.
What do you think that's about?
I don't know. I've just come to realize this. It's just been sort of a new thing I've been mulling over is, like all these makers that I follow, like there's many of them. There's a whole circuit in the US there's like so many craft schools, so many woodworking schools. It's a huge industry. But those makers out in the market, like they're making their living from teaching. They're not necessarily making their living through the craft itself.
I wonder, I could be completely wrong. So you tell me that, and the first thing that comes to my mind is, because people don't want to buy the chair. When they spend the money to go to the chair making school, they're not spending money for a chair. They're spending money for the experience and the fantasy of being a chair maker.
Yes. So we place great value in these instructors and their skill. But if we valued that level of skill, then we should be supporting all of those makers that can create those things.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case. There's a very select elite group that teach at these schools. But for every one of those instructors, there's hundreds of people trying to make a living doing the work, but that's a lot harder.
Mm-hmm. So the same people who are going to these schools will then turn around and buy their chairs from IKEA.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Some of them are great supporters of craft too. No doubt. But yeah, so it's again, the economics, it's kind of weird.
I don't know if this question you can even begin to answer, but I mean, this is your 7th year teaching fine furniture. No, 8th year teaching fine furniture. How do your students generally break down? Is there more artists? Are there more people who are trying to get their ticket in order to make a living as a Red Seal? Are they people like me who are on their, second careers and they're curious about doing something completely different than what they were used to doing?
It's honestly, it's so wide ranging. You can't really pin it down.
Yeah.
Like every year so I have 18 students per intake and it's 10 months. So there's always like maybe 3 or 4 that are within 2 or 3 years graduated from high school. 10, 26 to 34-year-olds. And then
us oldies.
Then a few older folk.
Senior citizens.
Yeah. I usually get a few transitioning out of Canadian Forces or RCMP or something like that. Almost every year I have one of those folks. So it's really, people are coming for all different reasons. Some people want to work in industry, but a lot of folks are looking for, like what you came to the program for, which was to like learn how to make furniture.
And to turn on a part of my brain that I didn't spend much time using. That was alienated from my other parts of my brain.
Yeah. Well, we spend so much time in our heads.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that really turned me on to this was that I was still using my head, my intellect, but in a different way that brought in like creative parts of myself and problem solving. But then it culminated in my hands and like physically creating something, which is not easy. I often use the analogy, it's like learning a musical instrument. And people come in and they've watched some YouTube and they're like, well, why is my work not good? It's like, well, you have to earn it.
Yeah.
You have to put in the hours, and my work wasn't good either. And nobody's is going to be when they start off. And you have to like really put in that time. But there is this marriage between like, it's not just, and let me back up. So like people who work with their hands have often been sort of looked down upon.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't have, if they had the smarts, they would go to school and they would teach college and be a doctor.
Put on a tie and work in an office.
But it's like, what is a surgeon? A surgeon is someone who works with their hands. And yes, they have a lot of that learning and background, but so does someone that's welding pipes for the oil pipeline. Like, it's just a total misconception that it's work for dummies. It's actually work for really creative, like motivated people. And at the college, we get quite a number of folks through that have a university degree, and this is what they're turning to. And it's not just the economics of it; it's the pleasure in creating.
Pleasure in the deeds of the present.
Pleasure in the deeds of the present. Indeed.
One thing I've been really interested in lately is the editing process, because you have the creative process, and then as part of that, though, it may be, and one of the books I'm reading right now argues the most important part of that is the editing process, taking an idea and refining it and changing it until the inherent beauty of the idea finally pops out, which might not be till the 7th or 8th or 20th iteration.
Yeah.
Is that something you've experienced as well?
Oh yeah.
How does that manifest in woodworking? Because different, if you're a painter or an illustrator, I would think it would be a bit easier to create different iterations of an idea. But if you're a woodworker, it's a lot more labor and time intensive.
Yeah, everyone has their own process. I would, like my own process would be to start with some rudimentary sketches, and I'm not the greatest. I'm not an artist in that way. But I'll get it to the point where it's clear, at least in my mind's eye, what it's like, and working on paper helps with that. And then sometimes I'll take a bunch of garbage materials like cardboard or scrap wood or whatever, and I'll just bang something together so I can look at it in front of me. And I also use computer modeling as well. So I'll use like a combination of those. And then, don't tell my students this, but I will often start without a complete idea of what I'm making, which I've earned, and they have to figure it out more, because at school it just doesn't work well that way.
I was going to say, after 28 years, I think you're entitled to a couple of shortcuts.
Yeah. And I'll just sort of see how it goes.
Have you ever gone through that process, and you've gone through several sketches, you've gone through a couple of mock-ups, you made something out of scrap wood, and then you make it, and you're just unhappy? This is not what I wanted. It looks like the sketch, but when you actually see the final product, it is not what you had in mind.
It usually bears some resemblance to what I had in mind, but some are more successful than others, for sure.
What differentiates more successful from less successful?
Sometimes it's the amount you just work at it. Like, there's this idea that, that person's creative and they just have good ideas, and you think they come out fully formed. Oh, they made this amazing thing again. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. Like, it takes work, and for every great thing that someone might produce, there might be 100 shitty ideas that you just don't get to see. And everyone puts their best stuff out there. There's also people that work within, like, they have their own style or their own aesthetic. And once you hone that, it's its own language. Like, going back to arts and crafts, if you gave me a piece of paper right now, I could sketch a dozen really good, strong arts and crafts design for something, because there's a vocabulary to it. So, and same with, like, right now, mid-century modern, it's like, I'm kind of getting tired of it. It's everywhere, and it's got its own language, and I can sit down and I can bang you out a mid-century modern chair, right? So there's like all these different vocabularies. So in that way, you're also not starting from nothing. And if you're an established maker, you have things that you make, and like, just a visual vocabulary or an aesthetic. So you're starting often from that, and then it's a process of refinement still. So there's this really well-known craft maker who kind of started the craft revival movement in the U.S. His name's Sam Malouf, and he built the
I
same.
remember, yeah, the rocking chairs.
Yeah, he built the same chair for like 30 years.
Did he ever build anything else, or just worked on that one chair for 30 years?
No, he built other things, but he became really known for his chair. And of course, it's not the same chair. It's a series of subtle changes over many, many, many years. But it's still the same chair, but it's not the same chair.
What do you think separates the good makers from the great makers?
Not trying to emulate what's gone before.
But how do you not? I feel like everything that's been made, that could be made, has been made. You just are variations on a theme at this point.
Usually, but then every once in a while, someone comes along and it's like, oh, they saw something, there was something there. And one of the, I remember having this experience of discovering Brent Comer's work, that other maker that I mentioned. This was quite a few years ago now. And he was on the forefront of something, and it was this like a nature-based aesthetic. And I think he just picked up on the changing like environmental movement and sort of psychology. And he took what we would consider basically garbage weedwood, red alder that grows here. And he made these cubes out of them, but he left the outside of the tree. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I remember you talking about him.
Yeah. And they just absolutely took off. And no one had really, he just tapped into something. And then he's done like extraordinary sculpture work. And there's something like very unique about it. The scale and the materials. And I think he just tapped into something. It was at the right time. And sometimes people come along at the right time and they recognize, I think it's often tied or can be tied to like what is going on in the world that has nothing to do with craft. So when I'm teaching furniture history, I'm always telling students like the way to make this relevant and interesting rather than just a bunch of old boring stuff on the page is to think about the social, political, economic times that produced that work, right? Like what was going on. And when you approach it that way, it can be really interesting. Like during this period of time, the English switched from using walnut to mahogany because walnut was what the French were using. And, we don't like the French right now. And we're colonizing the world. So suddenly we have access to all this amazing mahogany, which is great for carving. So you end up with all these Chippendale chairs that have this made out of mahogany, which blah, blah, blah. But if you don't know the political background, you're like, oh, well, it's just another chair. But actually, it's showing the changing fashion of the time because of the economic and political climate. So my challenge to my students is like, okay, well, look around you now. What is happening now? And if you can like really figure that out and identify it, then that might give you that certain advantage or make you one of the makers that really gets noticed.
That's really interesting. And so recently you went to teaching 3 days a week so you could go back to making more in your own studio, right?
Yeah.
So imagine you're in your studio. What would, because we live in some ridiculously trying, eventful, potentially earth-shattering times, politically, economically, socially.
Yeah.
If I asked you to make something that was very appropriate to this time and this age and these politics, I don't expect you to tell me the final form, but like what, I guess I'm trying, we have Trump and we have war and we have, environmental degradation. And Like what would channel or what would reflect our reality?
Hmm. Wow. I don't know I can answer that right now. I keep going to
Or have you seen any other makers who you think are reflecting the current sorry state of the world?
I don't know. It just got a lot sorrier.
That's true. It is pretty new.
Yeah, it's new, so I'm not really sure what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
But I think retreating to the joy of making, because it's like we can actually make sense of that, whereas the world just doesn't fucking make sense right now. So if we can kind of like maybe just chill out in the studio and feel okay carving a Windsor seat.
One thing
Maybe that's good therapy for me.
That's great therapy. One thing I've noticed in Camus, I've noticed it with Camus collective members, but also customers who come in. We talked earlier about the desire to become a craftsperson and the DIY trend. And it's partly, I'm sure, because people are seeing it on Instagram. But I feel also like when it comes to growing your own food, making your own clothes, maybe that's a reaction to living in a much more precarious world where we can envision a time when, you might not be able to access clothes and food and clean water as readily or as cheaply.
Well, it already happened during COVID.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like it feels like we're about to go through that again, or starting to go through that again.
Yeah.
For sure. Especially in Canada, where I think I heard 60% of our food comes from the US, which is terrifying, of course.
A statistic I heard was that living on Vancouver Island, we have something like 9 days of food.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the ferries stopped, we would have 9 days of food and then we'd all be just fucked.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. That's insane.
Yeah.
That's absolutely crazy. What gives you hope in these dark and trying times, whether it's through your art or through your family or through your friends?
Oh, this too shall pass.
Yeah.
And just connecting with people in a real way, like building community. And even though I'm stepping back from teaching to work on my own, like to work less teaching and get back to making on my own, I still can't stop thinking about teaching, but just in a very different way.
Yeah.
Like I want to teach outside. Like one of my dreams is to do some chair making workshops that are like more of the like reflecting some of the couple of the courses that I've done. But I really want to invite people into that joyful place of like, I'm going to hand you a really sharp tool and the right piece of wood and just have you experience what that feels like. Because it's actually quite thrilling to do that. And I think it's very, very therapeutic. And to do it with other people is community building. And like really empowering to actually like make something real. It's not going to save the world, but it might like make you feel better. And it's just positive. Like I can't think of anything that's not positive about it.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. Sandra Carr, thank you very much, my friend.
Thanks, Joel.
If Jesus Christ came back today like you threaten he will, which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus